guy. I don't know whether or not that was serious, but okay. So we're getting started now. So hello everybody, and welcome. I think I updated all the titles and the chat and all the things that need to be updated so that we're live now. Anyway, I'm AJ. I run the Utah Stack.js meetup, and tonight I am presenting. I want to first thank, it's weird because I'm presenting and introducing myself, but you know, that's how we do. So I want to first thank Vivint for hosting us, Eric for handling that for us tonight. So we've got pizza and a space to meet, so thank you very much to them. And then if you'd give a warm welcome to our presenter, AJ ONeal.
Deal.
All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So I'm going to present on the axioms of JavaScript, and essentially, let's see. The controversial little hot take is guide to being boring and effective in the language that the world loves to hate. That's what this is. So this is like, if you hated Douglas Crockford's talks on how not to be an idiot in JavaScript, you're going to loathe this one. Because I think that Crockford was way too expressive and used way too many features of JavaScript that are completely unnecessary. So there we go. The alternate title, a subtitle, what I've learned in 15 plus years of programming in JavaScript. I'll tell you one thing. I have never encountered a need for classes or prototypes. I think the only time I've ever had to use new is because of some sort of browser DOM thing that required it. There's just like, you just don't need most of the language. So I'm AJ. My non-spicy tweets, like totally tech focused, no angry rants, at _beyond code. And if you want to hire me for stuff, the Root Company. And if you want to watch my streams, Kool-Aid86. Anyway, I'm a dangerous wrong thinker. As you are already aware, I'm an equal opportunity offender. And I am a technophobic technologist extraordinaire. So I believe that we're all going to die. That said, here's the first thing about JavaScript, or just programming in general. Most of this is actually just programming in general. But very counter to today's culture, what you want to do is limit usefulness. You want to do one thing and do it well. And in particular, an example comes to mind that's the opposite of this. I tried in a lot of these to give an opposite and then a pro, and some of these will be able to do that and some not. But, meaning some of those that's in the slide and some of them not. But a great example of this is Lodash. Lodash has no specific function or utility. It does a lot of things. It does a lot of very low value things, but there's nothing specific of high value that it does. And so that would be what we want to avoid, is creating stuff that does lots and lots and lots of stuff that's very useful, because you're just creating bloat. And most of it you're not going to need. So to quote Crockford, quoting this French dude, perfection is achieved not when there's nothing more to add, but when there is nothing left to take away. And this is how we know that Crockford was clearly imperfect during his reign over JavaScript, because he did not take nothing. He repented of that a bit later, though. He did take more stuff away in the talk that he gave 2 or 3 years ago. He finally gave up a lot more. Or in other words, you ain't gonna need it. So when JavaScript has so many tools available to you, you can think about like, we want to support this framework and that framework, and it's got to work for this use case, it's got to work for that use case. You're not getting paid for that. Why would you take your sweat and tears and blood and pour it into a SaaS company that doesn't even have a profitable business model? And 2, if it's your own company, just get the product out the door first. So limit usefulness in what you create. Don't try to create something that is categorically complete. Try to create something that is functionally complete. So, categorically, Lodash. Functionally, let's say an authentication module. All right. So, zero, 2. Less magic in code, more magic in tooling. You know, we've got all this transpiler craziness, we got all this bundler, builder, packer, faux tree shaking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. LLM that shit. And not really LLM, because LLMs aren't sufficiently advanced and we don't really have good targeted LLMs towards coding. But another way, if I could get past this, stop, go away. Okay, apparently in order to view notes on my phone, I have to sign into the internet. So I'll do that. So I can see the notes.
Everything was better connected to the internet.
Apparently, and I couldn't get back to my notes without it. Okay, so other examples of this, like turn on your autocomplete if that helps you, not if it hurts you. There's the new term, the GPT pause, where people have started getting to the point where they're not actually working, they're just sitting waiting for autocomplete to happen from GPT. So maybe don't put yourself in that hurdle, but where there's autocomplete that's good, that's snappy, that works for you, use it. Macros. So macros are generally considered in programming parlance to be pre-processor, meaning when you run the compiler. In JavaScript, that would be more like transpilation, and I'm not really for that, but I mean macro more in the terms of what many people would call snippets, meaning that you type in 2 letters like FN and hit enter or space, and then it fills out a function body for you. Or you do fn dot a comma b, hit space and enter, and then it fills out the function body with a and b, stuff like that. Like there's a finite number of common tasks that you have. You can create macros for them. And you can create them in any editor, whether it's Vim or whether it's VS Code or whatever it is. So take advantage of that. Then also LSP. I think LSP is a double-edged sword. In some languages it works really great, and other languages it does not. I've not found it to be that helpful in JavaScript, but if you've got a great LSP plugin that works for you, then use it.
This is the first thing I didn't know. What is LSP?
Oh, sorry. Language Server Protocol is what it stands for, but what colloquially when people say LSP, what they mean is the integration between a language server and your code editor. So it's somewhat of a misnomer because LSP is the protocol, but the term is used to mean the server, the client, the whole bundle together. So like when you are typing and you hit dot, so say I do document dot and then it auto-completes with body, head, etc. That would be LSP.
Okay. A lot of people call that IntelliSense, but that's too narrow. That seems like a better term. LSP.
Sure, I think IntelliSense is just fine. Colloquially, I think the two are equal. Yeah.
It's like IntelliSense is like a branded product that's built into it. So.
Yeah, it's like LLM versus GPT kind of thing. But IntelliSense was first, and it doesn't necessarily follow. Well, I guess if it's a Microsoft product. Anyway, yeah. So also formatters. You don't actually have to type the trailing semicolon if you don't want to. In many cases, you don't have to type the trailing comma if you don't want to. Just, hit save and let the formatter do it for you. You don't have to waste time hitting the space bar 8 or 12 times to get your alignment. Well, one, your editor hopefully will do that for you when you hit enter, but also the formatter can do that for you. And then linters. So rather than trying to put more into the language or complicate like the frameworks and rather than adding meta-programming, just add dev time tooling. That's what I mean by that. All right, so our first axiom, no comment, don't do this. What do I mean by that? Whenever you have a comment, I'm giving a very simple example here, but whenever you have a comment, what that's really saying is that you have some sort of process or calculation or something that's being done that is probably too complex and is not described well. So now most of us contextually will recognize 24 times 60, we'll get that and we'll understand what this is without needing a comment or descriptive name because it's something that we encounter so frequently. But rather than calling it MS, call it milliseconds in day. And then here's a hypothetical example. Sorry, I didn't spend the time to come up with a real one, but you can imagine, you've seen this before. You've seen where there's some mathematical operation that has 4 or 5 components to it. And sometimes it ends up going on to a second line. There might be multiple sets of parentheses, etc. Just break it down. And you don't need a comment for it. Like this is something where you might say, oh, well, we need a comment here. We need a whole paragraph to describe what this does. Well, maybe you don't. Maybe just break down each component. And then it's like, yep, it's clear what this does. It's clear what this does. It clears what this does. It's clear what that does. So this is a poor hypothetical example. But hopefully you get the point. Because I think you've seen this code enough. You know what we're referencing here. All right. Number 2, now this is probably my most controversial take of the evening. Don't make waves. What do I mean by that? Never double in parentheses, not even once. And this is pretty extreme, but I live by this, and my life is better for it. I do. Oh, dagnabbit. My wife is not silenceable, and she's doing a group chat. Because my wife is like, if she texts me, then it's important. The problem is that if she texts someone else, then I also get the notification. So that's what that is. Okay, so here's an example, right? I said this is less readable code. Some people are going to argue against it. That's fine. But what should we do instead? Well, just do let x, let y, get area. It's simpler to scan over. And I actually argue that in a lot of these cases, people are coming from Java or C#, or they're coming from some other language where you just accessor all the things. Probably you just get rid of all that and just have whatever it is be the variable and not have something that's returning something that doesn't need to. You could just access it directly from the object or have it passed in from up above. Just have it passed in a simpler form. I'm very against the having accessors, getters and setters for all the things when they're not needed. Now, if we get into, if we want to talk about double one-way data binding, what's the correct term for that, Todd? Do you know? Like reactive programming, right? So where you have a getter and a setter because there's a life cycle component to what you're doing. That makes sense. But in general, just try to keep it simpler. Also, I don't even do this. What?
Let's go back a bit. A middle ground solution to preventing this would be assigning it to a single variable without having to between 2 variables. But just like hitting enter to separate your double parentheses. Into which category would you put that here back?
Well, what?
Go back one more. Okay, here. We're just going to press enter to separate these arguments into separate lines. Is that a good good practice or bad practice according to this philosophy?
I'm going to pick the middle ground on that one.
Okay.
Because there are definitely places where I would say. So basically, the way that I program is a closing parenthesis ends the line, where a closing parenthesis is an action rather than syntax. Well, the one exception to that would be, for example, like what you're just mentioning when you're declaring an object. Where sorry, the exception to what I just said would be declaring a function, because declaring a function, the parenthesis does not end the line. And that's required in JavaScript because the way that JavaScript handles blocks. Well, I mean, I guess it's not required for functions, but it's required for other things, so might as well be consistent. Keep the curly up on the top line. Okay. All right. So even for something like an if, I just break it out. And there's one other benefit to breaking it out like this. You can give it a good name, because oftentimes what you're trying to check from the function is not necessarily clear. But if you can turn something into a negative when you do the check, in JavaScript that's better, because in JavaScript you can have mismatched types. Like your tooling may not catch when what's supposed to be a number is accidentally still a string. Like say you took something from a form input or from the CLI that you read from the user. It's supposed to be a number, it's accidentally a string. it turns out to be an empty string instead of 0, and you do a not, or I'm not necessarily describing it well, but there are times when, okay, here's a good example. If banana is greater than 0, like that might be false, but that's not what you actually want to check. So what you could do is reverse it and then not, put the not form of it, and what that would do is make it so that in the case that I'm going to skip that because it's hard to explain without putting it on the slide.
Okay, what about if banana is empty and banana is peeled? How would you? No?
Exactly.
Okay.
No, but let me rephrase in simpler terms. Because you can have unexpected results in JavaScript, it is better to check for success of the thing that you want than it is to check for lack of success. It is better to check explicitly for an error, if that's what you need to check for, than it is to check to check for not an error. Whatever is the thing that is definitely going to exist in the case that you're trying to check for the presence of that thing, because just because you don't get the error condition, just because something is not greater than, does not mean that it is less than or equal to. There we go. That's what I needed to say. That's it. Just because something is not greater than does not mean that it's not less than or equal to, because in JavaScript, it could both be not greater than and not less than or equal to. So you can't do an either or. Sorry for that tangent. Let's wipe that off from our memories. All right. So this one I think is actually not too controversial, and you'll see improves readability immediately. So return something or return nothing. So you see a lot of stuff like this where somebody calls a function to do some side effects and they return it, but there's nothing that the function returns. So quintessential example, an HTTP handler in Node. So people will do the return next and return JSON, but in reality, these don't return anything, so it's confusing, especially when you consider the history of promises and async await and all that stuff.
Yeah, but the return next is to make sure it exits the function.
It's a better way.
No, the return next is not. If you return, you exit the function. Returning next has no value. So if you call next and then return.
What I mean is it never gets to the res.json if you return next. Whether you have it on separate lines or not, the return next makes sure that res.json never gets run.
Right, it just doesn't communicate what it's doing, is what I'm saying. So this communicates the intent clearly. And if you want to be more clear, and this is actually how I write my code, no joke, this is what I do. JavaScript has void. And so if you want to clearly communicate that you are only using a function for side effects, you can void it. And although I didn't do it because my formatter always inserts the semicolons, if you use void, you don't have to put semicolons in your code. So like there's like a list of like 4 different things that if you do this and you need a semicolon, you do this, you need a semicolon, you do that. And I've never wanted to have the mental gymnastics of figuring out does a semicolon belong or not. I am almost certain that if you use void to capture a function, if you don't intend to capture whatever it's doing, you don't need semicolons. Now, then you're typing out void, so if you're really worried about stressing out your pinky, then you'll just be stressing out your index finger instead. But it communicates clearly that either I'm calling this function for side effects, or I didn't accidentally forget to do something with this function. I actively chose to ignore it.
Right. I have never seen anyone use void in my life. What does void do specifically?
It is like underscore is in Go. It is just a capture. It captures the result of an expression.
This is a fairly
That does not
benign
explain it
example.
for me.
But like, you know how you can like do the curly boys with several variables in there
Are you talking about objects?
and then do it equals, yeah, well, an object with several variables in there, variable names that you would assign to, so you can do multiple assignments all on the back. Out of like a function returns an object. You want to pull 3 things out of there and assign them to variables. You know,
I see. So it would be structured assignment.
yeah,
Okay.
you can just ignore one with void.
I actually didn't know that. Because I thought if you do var void, it is not syntactically invalid.
We wouldn't do var. I
Void
know.
var, right?
Well, because you have to, if you're going to, or let or whatever, var, let, const, if you're going to make an assignment, you make a declaration, and then void would be a keyword, so I would think that it would give you an error.
I would think that I was building off of the Go reference. So like you have multiple returns and you like underscore in Go. But if you have like a tuple you're trying to assign the places of, or an array or something, you structure an array.
But when you destructure with var, const, or let. And so I don't think that would be syntactically valid. But I could be wrong. I have not tried it. It'd be fun to try.
I'm very interested in trying that
Okay,
now.
we're gonna break for a
Side
second.
quest.
Side quest. All right, everybody.
Because there have been several times when I can't use a variable because I put it in a let to destructure it. And I'm like, I wonder if I could have done that in a void.
Yeah. So. Okay, so let A B equals 4237. Oh crap! I'm not going to be able to let it. Now I got to change. This is why it was annoying. But okay, so could I do void? Yeah, syntax error.
Yeah.
Oh, I was thinking instead of let, you would do void. And then the parentheses, that's what I thought you were saying.
Well, you
So
could certainly
delete
you
let,
could certainly
delete
just
let. Yeah, no,
Let's-
no, so void
you
and
can.
then
Oh, sorry. You
what's
can
after
void.
let.
You can void an expression.
Okay,
You can void an expression.
okay, well, would you try void and then, EF?
What?
So use void in place of let and do everything else that you were doing with let. Yeah, like that. I'm just.
I don't see the utility of this, but we'll try. Yeah, I don't think that's. Now, and if something's already assigned, so the question would be, can we destructure with void? No, we can't. So even if we're not doing an assignment, we can't destructure with void. So void captures an expression.
Okay, I've learned a couple of things void is not. You want to write a valid example of void just for me?
Looks like void causes the expression to not return any value and return undefined instead.
Yes,
Ah,
it captures let will capture an expression, void will capture an expression.
Piping into dev null.
Yes, into the void. Yeah.
okay. So if I wrote let into the void equal void 42, then the value into the void would be undefined.
Yes.
Okay.
I only use void in front of expressions. I don't know of any other way to use void.
Yeah, I don't see much use for it. This could be useful. Yeah.
Yeah, it's just communicating that you are using something for side effects, because if you don't capture, and so if you didn't have semicolons, let's say that you didn't have semicolons and you had 2 of these, void next 1, void next 2. If you stack next 1 and on top of next 2 without void, then you would end up invoking, no, if you had parentheses around it. Anyway, there's a case where you would end up invoking undefined, and it would say undefined is not a function. But if you have void there, then pretty much every case where the semicolon problems would come up, if you capture with void, then you won't have the semicolon problems.
Gotcha.
Well, and there's one other thing that I'll talk. Well, also just if you avoid the double parentheses, then you also won't run into a situation where you have the semicolon problem as well. So there's that. Anyway, this one is related. Return await or await without return. So very similar. So here we have do stuff, maybe promise. We're going to return maybe promise. And why I say maybe promise is because I cannot tell from reading this code whether a promise there is there or not. I cannot tell whether this is a synchronous function or an asynchronous function. And a lot of people like to do this because they want to say keystrokes. Leave that for the minifier. Let the minifier, turn the thing, into smaller bytes on the wire or whatever. And let your macros, v or a space to be async or something. So instead, if you do async function, then it's clear it's an async function. And if I do return await maybe promise, it's clear that I'm expecting this maybe promise is actually a promise. And this is something that could be detected in tooling, and I wish that the TypeScript checker would be better about detecting whether or not something is a promise, because I swear every single day I'm accessing a property that's undefined, and I'm like, how is this? Because I forgot the await. So for me, this has been hugely beneficial, just to always have the habit of anytime something is asynchronous, not even returning the promise from the asynchronous function directly, but always awaiting. And then you can take this, don't return, this is the other thing, it's just like with the next, don't return the promise if you're not using the promise. I will void a promise if I intend for it to be a dangling async function, or I will await it but not return it, because there's no sense of returning it if I don't want to use the value, especially when you're going through and refactoring code and trying to figure out where you have dependency on something. It's very confusing when something returns a result, and I try not to get 10 layers deep in code in the first place, but when you have to go look at some code and it's 10 layers deep and you see return at the bottom layer and you're like, crap, now I have to go track up here and see if I want to change the signature of this to change its return value, I have to go check all these things to make sure that they are also updated accordingly. But if I'm not actually using that value, well, why return it? Just await it instead. And I think a lot of that pattern came from the promises days, but async await is truly a blessing. And it's good that we have it, and it allows us to communicate more effectively. All right. And then this one, the reason I put the little emoji here is because it violates the rule of the double parentheses, but only because of the formatter. There's no reason that the parentheses actually need to be around this, other than that in other contexts, you need parentheses around an await sometimes, in which case the prior rule applies. Assign the thing to a variable and then do the stuff, rather than having bunches of parentheses trailing all over the place. But yeah, if there was something that had a value and I want to throw it away, I'll just void it. All right. This is another one that I think is also extremely non-controversial and extremely beneficial. Let errors bubble until they burst, meaning correct or classify, but do not catch. So here's our bad example. This is what you see in every README across the internet, especially since async await. Because everybody don't want to type more in their README, and so they just put a try-catch around everything, and they literally just have comment do stuff, and then you copy and paste that code and you build off of it, and then you've got now you've gone from callback pyramid of doom, and then promise pyramid of doom, and now you've traded that for try-catch pyramid of doom. That its own issue, but the thing that I'm bringing up here in particular is so many times I cannot count the number of code bases where somebody decided to put a try-catch around something and then they just dropped the error. And maybe they were doing that because they wanted to debug something. I actually don't know why people do this, because it doesn't logically make sense to me. I can't, I've tried, because it doesn't actually help debugging. I have not been able to figure out why people do this.
I know why.
Yes.
In boot camps and such, you're taught whenever you're doing something with the network or really anything that could have an error, you got to catch that. End of sentence.
Yeah, so we'll get to that a little bit later. But yeah, it makes no sense, because then it just continues on and then does bad stuff. Because
error happened.
Well, except that then the next error happens, and then you can't tell where the error was, because now you're getting this thing about something being undefined, but what actually happened was the network connection failed. So anyway, yeah, I mean, this is just, it should be intuitive enough. Don't throw away your errors, because then it's going to bite you in the butt when you need to handle an exceptional case, not by the programming term exception, but as in something that is exceptional that you did not expect. So instead, number one, what you want to try to do is correct the mistake, right? So if I read a file, there's a number of errors that can happen. Like there's permission errors, the file might not exist, etc. If you're trying to read a file and the file doesn't exist, let's say you're trying to read a config file, for example, the file doesn't exist. Well, what you could do, oh, and I gave the bad example here because I said make file and then I did make dir. But so pardon the incongruency in that. But if I'm trying to list a directory, the directory doesn't exist, I can mkdir to make the directory if it's supposed to be there. If I'm trying to read a config file and the config file doesn't exist, well, then I can just catch the error int, and then I can return an empty string or an empty object or whatever it was I was going to do with the file. You know, if I was going to parse the config file, I can return the string double brackets, and then my parser gets that, and then it parses it and it's got an empty config. Now, of course, don't do that if you actually want to surface to the user that they don't have a config file. But if it's something like, if you don't have a config file, we're going to use the defaults, then just hand back an empty config file. And that should be done in the error handler. And you'll notice that I don't use try-catch, because try-catch basically should be reserved for parse errors, things that you would literally unwind as if they never happened, and you can't do that with things that are asynchronous. And you can do that in general in JavaScript, but still, the basic premise applies that a try-catch would be for something that is, well, the only thing I can think of is a parse error. That's the only time I can ever think of using a try-catch would be parse error. In every other circumstance, it's a .catch because it's something that's asynchronous, and what I actually want to do is be able to correct classify, or what did I say? Yeah, but not catch. Okay, so another thing is you can classify an error. So here is an example. Oh, and another example of this would be like user sign in. To say a user clicks create account and they have the same username and the same like if a user tries to create an account with a password, please, if the user already exists, don't return this user is already registered. Instead, take the password, pass it to the authentication function, and then return the result of whether or not the password was valid. Because if I am coming back to your site and I just click sign up instead of sign in, and then my password manager fills in my password and I click sign up, you should just come back and sign me in because I already used the right password, rather than taking me back to, nope, you have to go click the sign in button and do this again. So that's another example of correcting the mistake. So classifying for a handler. So a good example of this would be, let's say I have a validation function and there could be a number of things that could go wrong. It could be a parse error, it could be whatever, right? But what I mean, this is an oversimplified example, but what I'm sure of, at least in the hypothetical example, because there could be something wrong in there that's actually a developer error or that's a system error or whatever. But for the purpose of this example, must validate is something that we know that it's going to be it's a user problem. I probably should have put a check here, like, if error code, user error, whatever. But we can set properties of the error, and I actually did this incorrectly because this is supposed to be object out of sign because status is not actually part of an error type. An object out of sign is what you can use to extend a type in JavaScript. So rather than what I'm showing here is just creating a new property willy-nilly, object.assign is actually for that purpose of communicating to tooling that you are extending the type intentionally rather than that you had a typo and typed the wrong property name. That was a different thing that I was talking about there. But what I'm saying here is, if you know what type of error it is, but you can't correct it, then your next step is to classify it. And so I can classify this as a 400 so that when it goes up to my error handler, the web server will send back, hey, 400, it's your fault. Or conversely, it could pop back 500, my fault. So I do this all the time. And with the 500 errors, when at my top level error handler and my request handler, when I see that it's a 500, I just send back an error ID so that I can look it up in the logs. I attach an ID to the error. I give the user back an ID so that if they contact support, they've got an ID, and then I can go find that ID in the logs. And I strip out the information that might be confidential information, like, if it's an internal error, you have no idea what the stack trace and what the error message might show. And so generally speaking, you want to clean that up. And then the last thing is don't catch uncorrectable errors, let them bubble up. So sometimes there's an uncorrectable error that is the exception to the rule. It's an uncorrectable error, but it's fairly benign, or it's something that happened in the past and I can't do anything about it now. So that's probably a fault in your application where you need to do some message handling or something so that that error could be surfaced. But for the purposes of this example, what I could do is say, okay, there's something that isn't a fatal error, but I also want to capture it somewhere. Don't capture it down there. Let it bubble up to your top level error handler, and let your top level error handler see that the code is ewarn or whatever. And again, this should have been object.assign to assign code ewarn onto the error object. But let that bubble up to your top level error handler, and now you can have all of your error handling in one place. You don't have to go searching through the code to figure out what happened. You can put other pieces of information on here to help debugging be easier. So for example, my request handlers, I will put the URL on any internal error. So anything that is not an error that I'm explicitly intending to return to the user, the method, the URL, and perhaps even the request body, depending on where it's scoped in because there's some things that are sensitive. We wouldn't want to put the request body in the logs, like the credit card, for example. But anyway, you can have all of that bubble up to your top level handler. You got one place to do your logging and your figuring stuff out. So you don't just let things pass silently. And if there was something that's a truly background task, asynchronous process, that's truly the exception to the rule. The rule should be correct the error if you can reasonably correct it and do what the user wanted to do. Classify the error if you can't correct it, but you can be more generous in what you give back to the developer or the user. And then in the last case, at least let it bubble up so you can log it. And the very last case being special exceptions, not covered here. Exercise to the root. Okay, number 6 is gatekeeper at the gates and doorkeeper at the doors. And this is actually related to what I was just talking about. I don't have the example for this in code, but I was just talking about how the credit card handler, we don't want it to log the request body because it's the credit card handler. And if we get credit card information in our logs, we are now in violation of PCI, and more importantly, we're in violation of the trust of our users and our professional responsibility. So I can segment out things like error handling, that's special case error handling, or security concerns by, in the case of a web server, by URL, right? So anything that's under /API has to be validated except for, so let's say there's /API/public, doesn't need validation. /API/account needs validation. /API/admin has to be a super user. So I can put those middlewares in place so that the right layer of security or logging or the right middleware is in the right place. Not just willy-nilly throwing middlewares and handlers everywhere, but specifically segmenting off this component and its children, like everything that is a child of this component, it bubbles up to this component to do that type of handling. So that's what I mean by gatekeepers at the gates and doorkeepers at the doors, is that if you put the appropriate concerns in the appropriate place, then the right guard will be in place for that. And an anti-example of this would be where people are in their HTTP handler are putting in their parse logic, validation logic, business logic, all that sort of stuff into an HTTP handler. What should an HTTP handler do? HTTP handler should transform the request from HTTP into a format that the library containing the business logic should be able to handle it. Same thing is true with the database. The database should not be responsible, well, okay. Databases get a little fuzzy because people have different beliefs about where the business logic goes, but within a realm of concern, databases should not really be processing your business logic. Your model for your data should not be where all of your business logic is going right out as it's going out to the database. Put that in your business logic, and your storage engine should be what's serializing your data and whatnot. Any questions on that? Okay. Interfaces over generics. So again, I don't have the code example for this one, but this is essentially the idea that an interface is the function that something should do. And Go has a really good example of this with its read, write, close, read, write, seek, close, has a whole enumeration of interfaces for anything that you'd want to do with a file or a stream. So when you have an interface for something, it means that anybody outside from another team, from another library, can construct an object, and if the object has the right properties, then that object can go into your function and can be used. So it doesn't have to be a person, it could just be anything that has a name can go into that function. So this is, it would be much better if I had the code example for it, but this is something where don't think of your functions like, okay, this accepts a person. Think of your functions like, this accepts something with a name. And then what I mean over generics is both in TypeScript and there's certain patterns of JavaScript that are like generics where you are basically, whether at runtime as metaprogramming or syntactically and documentationally, you're trying to template out some sort of object to look like another object. Like you're trying to create a whole person object when all you need is a name. So that's kind of what I mean by interfaces over generics. The more common expression, interfaces over inheritance. But yeah, in the wake of what we've got going on in the JavaScript world, if like no one was ever hurt by using interfaces. It makes your code more accessible to other teams, easier to modify for the future you. And obviously we don't have keyword interface in JavaScript. They do in TypeScript. That's not what I'm talking about. What I'm talking about is the concept of an interface, which is that you are concerned about what you need to do the business, not concerned about the category of thing that you happen to be using in this particular case. Yes?
I will also say that interfaces give you a much stronger API contract, which sounds counterintuitive, but it is about the intent of the necessity between the API that you're building and the consumer of that API, which might be you, as opposed to like this rigid like bureaucracy of, well, you've got to fill out these forms first. Well, that's not related to what I need done by this function or whatever. So you just get stronger, more malleable, less blast radius API contracts.
Exactly. And one thing I don't remember if I actually have it in here, but I'll mention right now, is optimize for serialization. C++ was just flat out wrong. TypeScript is flat out wrong. We need to not optimize for hierarchy, we need to optimize for serialization, because most of what you want to do is send something over the network or send it to a storage engine. You either want to communicate or you want to persist. Those are the primary modes of what most applications do. For example, every SaaS company in existence. So whenever you have the option to think, oh, I want to attach a bunch of functions to this, I want to have a class hierarchy with this, think about, you have to reconstitute that, right? So if you add all of that stuff, now you have to add more functions, you have to add more handlers, you have to sanitize it better, you have to strip off the objects, you have to transform it in order to get it from computer A to computer B, like the client and the server, or the server and the database, or the client and the local cache, or the browser and its cache. Now, any time where you have to cross a boundary, it's always easier to cross the boundary with values rather than with functions, and classes imply that you're going to create a bunch of functions on something, which means that now you need to have a way to rehydrate. So not only do you need a new or a create, but you also need like an init, where you can then pass in an object that's been taken from the database, init it into something that's been instantiated, or you could just have the values that you need in the object that you need, and just pass that object around as a message rather than constructing a hierarchy out of it. So if that's in there, then we'll talk about it. Okay, no worthless abstractions. So worthless abstractions are typically easy to identify, and there's some exceptions to this for the sake of consistency. But worthless abstraction is basically where, say something takes in, you have a function from a library, and the library takes in 3 parameters, and you actually don't use the middle parameter. So it takes, say, first name, middle name, and last name. But all you actually need is first name and last name. So then you write a function that's got first name and last name, but not middle name. And then inside of that, you just create an empty string. And then now you've got your function that has first name, middle name, last name. And hey, look, you've saved yourself some keystrokes, because now everywhere you're going to use that function, you only have to pass in first name and last name instead of having to pass in explicitly an empty string everywhere. Well, except that you're only using that function in 3 places, and next week you get told, hey, we need to do middle names as well. So that would be the case of a useless abstraction, is where you're creating some sort of layer of containerization or hierarchy for a gain that isn't measurable. So abstractions should be deep, not wide. Meaning that when you have an abstraction over something, it's because maybe you need to do 6 or 7 steps, not because you want to eliminate one parameter out of a function call. Just pass in the null or pass in the empty string. And there's actually a talk on this by Austin, somebody.
I strongly agree with it, yes. Yes, I am Austin, and that is what we call it.
Oh, okay, right. I'm trying to remember. I've got it on Creeds of Craftsmanship, so I'll bring that up later. But if you go to creedsofcraftsmanship.com, there's a section that is like great talks, and there is one given by, I cannot remember his name. It's like Austin Hout or Austerhaust, or he's got some name that is not particularly memorable to me. And he gives a talk about software design principles. He just came out with a book. It's got like a yarn on the cover. It's Managing Complexity of Software was the talk, but this is one of the things that he hits on pretty deep and gives several great examples of. Oh yeah, John Austerhout. What do you know? I had it it was in the slide. Totally forgot. Yeah, so John Austerhout. He talks about abstractions being deep, not wide. And wide is your contract. So deep is your business logic. It's like these are the steps that need to be done. Wide is your contract, like what Todd was just talking about. The wider your contract is, the weaker your contract is, because the more things need to be there to satisfy your contract. So contract meaning inputs and outputs. I promise you these inputs, first, middle, last, and I promise an output, a formatted name with the last name first, a comma, then the first name, and then if there is a middle name, then a space and the middle name. Like that would be the contract that we have in that example function. So the wider the contract is, the less useful it is, because the more stuff you got to remember, you got to error check, you got to deal with. But the deeper it is, better, because that means you're getting a lot of value out of it, because you're abstracting something that's fairly complex and you're bringing it to a level where it's much simpler. All right. Okay, so no worthless extractions, but by the third or fourth time, you should know what it is. So this plays into something I'm going to say later. For every measure, a countermeasure. You've all heard dry. Don't repeat yourself, right? And so the idea behind dry is that anytime you see duplicate code, you have to abstract it away. And this is false because it leads to wide contracts and shallow abstractions that are worthless. But once you've done something 3 or 4 times, you've done some sort of process, like you've got to handle this PDF rendering. And at first you just needed to do it for one client, for one form, nobody else was using it, but then there's a couple of other clients, but they need a slightly different form, so you create another API for them, and then this service is getting popular with what you're doing for the PDFs, so you got one more client and their needs are different. Well, now you should start to be thinking, okay, how do I generalize this? How do I make this simpler for the things that are the same? So the idea is it's okay to be complex, but you don't want to be complicated. Complex meaning something that you abstract away that has many steps. Complicated would mean something that has many conditions, right? So say I've got a PDF renderer and one needs to render a table and the other one needs to render a book. So it would be bad to do if table, all this PDF stuff, like right header, if table, all this PDF stuff, else if book, all this PDF stuff, right footer. Well, we didn't repeat ourselves. But what would be better would be if we just had 2 functions and we did repeat ourselves, and the write table function writes the PDF header, writes the table, writes the footer. It's complex, it's got a lot of steps, but it's not complicated. There's not a lot of branching. There's not a lot of mental load about it. Likewise, the other function, write header, we duplicated, oh no, write paragraphs, write footer, or write book, or whatever it was. So, yeah, there's that. Await catch. Don't trade one pyramid of doom for another. So that one I already showed the example for earlier on and talked about, if you have try catch, try catch, try catch, try catch, you end up with this pyramid of doom and you've just gone from callback hell to promise hell to async hell. And so if you await catch and you have that mentality of correct, classify, but don't catch. And obviously there's a catch in these things, but the idea is you're not catching to silence, right? So that's what I was talking about there, is that you can simplify your code by handing the exceptional case in one place and only having that little bit of indentation where it needs to be, rather than increasing the indentation throughout your code. It's easier to read from top to bottom than left to right or right to top. So this is the case for returning early. And what I want to give an example is, if any of you have ever taken a communications class, or even some class where you had to do PowerPoints in high school or college, the professor always tells you, as part of technical writing, you list things out in bullet points, not paragraph form. And that is because the human brain is more adapted to be able to read things in a sequence. Again, deep is better than wide. This just comes up over and over and over again. So when you are writing your code, it is far better to have to read down more than it is to have to read back and forth. Now, what this has to do with return early, I should have the example here. I had the example. I don't know where it went. But if you can visualize with me for a minute, or maybe I could just, let me think. Yeah, okay. So basically, if you have a bunch of if-elses and they're going down the page, it is difficult to tell how things are connected, and you'll often end up with big blocks where, like, if, da-da-da, and then else, and then usually a little thing. So you can return early. You can check for the negative condition that you would return out, or it could be a positive condition. You check for the condition that completes the function, and now you have something that's very well scoped. It's like, if this, do that, done. And then you can have another 10 lines of code, but those 10 lines of code can be, in paragraph form, they can be segmented away from this if, so that clearly visually you can tell the difference. Whereas when you got the if else, if else, if else, if else, or even if you just have a big, huge if, and then a little else on the bottom, I mean, usually when there's there's a big if and a big else, that's a good candidate for creating a function that will handle each case separately. But the basic idea is that we don't want to have people to have to be scanning back and forth to figure out what the context of something is. And the code example that I had for this, if it had made it into the slide, basically shows how this situation ends up to where you have to, like with a try-catch in particular, that's another area where this is, you end up having to look down and then look back up to figure out what the context of something is to know on the next line what's going to happen. Whereas if you can get your code block so that whatever's in this block is managed in the block, whatever's in the next block is managed in the block, you shouldn't have to look between blocks to find correlations. Okay, optimize for the happy path, not for the exceptions. This is actually best exemplified in code that I can think of with the example of ripgrep. Has anybody used ripgrep? So one thing that ripgrep does is this is low-level memory management stuff, but ripgrep, all errors are pointers in ripgrep. And pointers have slow lookup times. But error objects can be of different sizes, so they could take up more memory and take longer to read and write. So what he does in there is all errors are just pointers. And so for the error case, it's slower, it's less efficient, but it's the error case. We don't care. So in general, when you're trying to figure out, how am I going to handle this? How am I going to do that? If there's one path where handling the error really well makes your code less readable, more difficult to understand, less pleasurable or pleasant to you, then just do the non-optimal thing for the error. Do the optimal thing for the code that people need to read all the time, for the code that's executing all the time. Don't be an idealist about the errors, be an idealist about the path that you expect the user to go down. And we will get back to some code examples a little later. I just didn't have as many for the ones in the middle. When it is broken, it is the right time to fix it. This is something I found in a Chinese fortune cookie. So as you are...
Did you fix the cookie?
No. That's a good catch.
I tried.
Let me see if I had that one. No. You succeeded. So just when you are going about your day-to-day work, whether it's like sprint planning or whatever, like when something's broken, when you encounter something that's broken, that's the time to go in and dig in and fix it. Not to put it in a backlog and like I know that some people are going to, managers sometimes say blah, blah, blah. The other thing is at the end of the day, your job is to like create the best value that you can for your client or for your employer. And they don't necessarily need to know that in this sprint, you spent a whole day fixing an error that you didn't put in the backlog because they don't know enough to know one way or the other. And at the end of the day, it benefits the company the most to fix the problem when you encounter the problem rather than putting the problem off to the side to wait until it becomes a critical issue. Now, obviously, there's some things that you can use good judgment and you can understand, no, this doesn't need to be fixed right now. But I hear too many people feeling like there's some sort of time pressure, and all time pressure is artificial. I mean, SaaS companies are driven by sales bros, and sales bros have no concept of programming, nor do they care. And the sales decisions are made based on getting more investment, not on pleasing the end customer. So these things are divorced from one another. You're always going to get pressure, but they don't know whether something is going to take a day or a month. And frankly, it doesn't matter because of the way that the whole business is put together. So if you just fix the thing that's going to make bring the best business value when you encounter it, then you'll be better off for yourself and your team. Okay.
To that point, I would say that a large amount of the time, if I've taken the trouble to, I found the error, I've investigated and verified it really is the error, that's, more than 50% of the work. If I now backlog it, someone else or myself is going to have to redo all of that
You got more
Get
brain
back
work.
to the point where you're ready to actually work on the problem.
Yep.
So it's often more efficient to just fix it.
Yep. Now, but this plays into previous as well. I tried to order these so that they kind of waterfall into one another. But this plays into the, what you said plays into the previous. You want to avoid useless abstractions because anywhere you have an abstraction, when there's an exceptional case, when there's an error, the abstraction is your enemy, and that's where you're going to be spending your time going through and changing a bunch of methods. So if you avoid useless abstractions in the first place, you don't try to save a couple of keystrokes to pigeonhole yourself, then when you get to the point of needing to fix something that's broken, it's going to be so much easier to go fix the thing that's broken. All right, next one. The constraint of the medium defines the art. So this is the biggest problem, I think, in JavaScript. The biggest, hugest problem is that there's no constraints, right? Like if I look outside, is this art?
The outside?
Yeah.
No, it's nature.
What?
It's nature.
Mostly not.
Well, I didn't give any constraints, right? And if there are no constraints, then there is no art, there is no craftsmanship. Now, if I say, look at the design of the parking lot, particularly the way that the trees are arranged, is this art?
That's literally what I thought. I'm like, someone, manicured those trees.
Yeah, so there's been craftsmanship both.
And anyone who's driven on a road with not straight lines appreciates the straight lines of the parking spots.
But I define the art as, there's blue and green outside. There you go. It's art.
But my point in this is that the fewer constraints we have, the less of art that we have. Somebody can literally make art out of trash, recycled aluminum cans and plastic bottles and beer bottles. And there are art exhibits that are made out of trash, but the thing is, you have to constrain what type of trash. Like, this is plastic bottle art, or this is beer bottle art, or this is, And so in our craft, we have to have constraints, or we don't have a craft. And anything goes is not a workable constraint. And you've probably seen this. I see this all the time. People want to use every single feature of the language. If the feature is there, it means we must use it. And this is just not true. We only should use the features that bring benefit. And, I'm talking about art here, but I think art is a very dangerous word because at the end of the day, the art should be the result that we produce, not how the CPU or the parser handles the code, because no one sees that but you, and then that's just kind of bloating your own ego and it doesn't benefit anyone in the world. I mean, it's kind of like if you create some art and you hide it in a drawer, is it art? I don't know, that's a philosophical question, but I would say no.
But if it falls in the forest, it is.
Exactly.
Okay.
So, but for something to be art, it has to be appreciated or have an avenue of appreciation, and the internal workings of how you choose to do your semicolons and your space. Although I think that is important that it's consistent. That's not where your art is. Your art is in what you deliver to the customer. That is the craftsmanship. When I buy a piece of furniture, we've all had experiences with something, video games, whatever it is. When you consume something, the craftsmanship is in what is available to you. That's where the art is. The art is not in someone's personal fetishes as they were creating the thing. So we have to have constraints so that we have craftsmanship, so that we can share the code, and that we can deliver a product. Otherwise, you got this. This is PHP, by the way. See, it starts with HTML. That's how you know it's PHP. See, and you don't have to have there's no specific. And saying PHP is actually a little too harsh. The anti-example here is HTML, because HTML has no constraints. You can open up a file and you can put in binary, you can put in UTF-8, you can put in ASCII, you can put open brackets, closing brackets. You will never get a parse error on HTML. So HTML is the opposite of art. Now XHTML, you can get a parse error, but it turns out people didn't like that. And so the browsers that gave parse errors, that's why we got Internet Explorer for so long. Firefox got rid of the parse errors. All of a sudden, Firefox is a popular browser. And now we got Chrome. But anyway, yeah, that's just an unfortunate thing. Oh yeah, and then I mentioned this earlier. For every metric, a counter metric. And I'm going to get to a good example of that later, so I might skip that. Or do I have one right here? Oh, okay, yes. No, this is the example that I had in mind. So for every metric, a counter metric. So we talked earlier about comments, right? I say always comment your code. Thanks, GPT. Great job. Fetches the JSON from the URL. Oh, really? Right? But then there's the opposite, right? If I say your code shouldn't have comments, then we get, x equals 24 times 3.5 divided by 7 to the power of 2, logarithm, and it's like, well, what is this? And I literally had this problem. This is a product that went to the military, by the way. There was a number that was close to pi. It was like the first 4 or 5 digits of pi, except the last digit was wrong. And I thought, oh, this person typoed when they were typing pi. There was no comment, and the variable didn't have a name. And I changed it, and then about a day later, I got an emergency alert that things were broken in the most recent build, that all the data was wrong. And I'm thinking, well, that's really weird. How could that possibly be? And then one of the people that had been on the project longer was looking through recent changes and said, no, why did you change the 3.145, whatever it was, to the other one? And I said, well, but the thing was, I renamed the variable to pi, And so then it was clear to him, when he read the code, it was clear to him, oh, you thought this was pi. But it just so happened to be that because it was a radar system that the data was coming from, and it attenuates, and so it needs a correction factor. The correction factor just happened to be probably because pi is a constant in nature and affects things like sine waves. It just so happened to be that the manual analog correction factor was very close to pi to correct the sine wave to get it to be the shape that it really was. But what we're actually measuring was probably the difference between pi and what it should have been, because basically the wavelength was out of phase and then slightly distorted, probably because the metal on the antenna was slightly the wrong length for whatever. So anyway, that's just an example of when the code is not descriptive. That's really the rule that we're trying to get at. The code should be descriptive. So we shouldn't put comments on things that just waste space, because the other thing that's going to happen is that this is going to get replaced. It's going to be like, oh, we don't actually need to do the round trip on the server. We can just do that in the database. And so then it becomes db.get, and then URL changes to ID, and then the comment still says fetches the JSON from the URL. Right? That's why we don't want to have comments, is because comments are not enforced by the tooling to be correct. So we want to avoid them, but we want the code to be descriptive so that we don't end up with something that's almost pi but not quite. It turns out to be an analog correction factor for a sine wave that just happens to be close to pi because the natural world is close to the theoretical world, but not quite. And finally, or there might be one more after this. I think this might be it. My number one rule, especially in the realm of JavaScript, if it sounds cool, for heaven's sakes, don't do it.
Okay, but what if it's clever?
No. So cool is an adjective, which means unintuitive, non-obvious, or for those in the know. And you know this because if anybody has ever said to you, hey, have you seen this cool new feature? And you look at it and you're like, wow, I wouldn't have expected that it would do that. That's pretty neat. Well, that would be what we'd call unintuitive, not obvious, and for those in the know. So if it sounds cool, don't do it. So no more weak maps for you, unless you actually need it. I mean, there are cases where these two go hand in hand, right? Like you need to do something that is clever, that is cool, that is unintuitive, but you need to do it to meet some sort of performance characteristic or to work around some sort of bug, and that's where your paragraph comment comes into play. But if your comment's 3 words long, probably should be variable names. And if you could do it in a way that is intuitive and obvious and boring and unambiguous, And that's probably the better way to do it. Oh, and there were some people in on the comments.
No, there wasn't.
Oh, it was just somebody offering me a promotion, which is excellent. I was looking for a promotion, and now I got one. All right. So anyway, some of that was controversial. I know y'all are still going to be making waves, even though I told you not to. But hopefully there was some good takeaways there. Any questions, comments, additional thoughts? We can now dogfight.
I'll offer a positive review.
Oh, okay.
That was it.
That was what?
Yeah, that was the full review. Just, it was good.
Okay.
I mean, I probably still will make waves because that seems like a trivial thing. But some of the stuff in here seems very important and good.
Yeah.
I make a lot of waves in tests. So I don't know if a test framework doesn't involve closing a dozen nested nonsenses often.
Yeah, I mean, that's can be like data. Are you describing data, which is what a lot of the test frameworks try to do? They try to make it like functions look like data, or are you doing a process? Because if you were just most of the time you just make an array of arrays is what it would be. But instead they have like the it describe and then the nest it.
Yeah.
You might like Zora if you're doing JavaScript. Zora is, once you see it, you could write it yourself in about 15 lines. But if you don't want to write those 15 lines, Zora's got your back.
Sadly, I have to work with others in my JavaScript, and so I will need something fairly popular, I guess. This is why we use Angular.
That seemed to be an oxymoron
No, it's still,
in the enterprise.
yeah.
In products that make money.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's like C#, like, or .NET in general, like, nobody likes it. Nobody's writing, like, grand open source products for consumers in it, but there's a reason Azure still has the billions they make.
And if they hadn't switched to Angular 2, it might still be in the runnings.
Yeah, actually. I have a pet theory that React got popular because, and I watched that ngconf back in the day in Europe while it was live, and it was just a PR nightmare.
I watched it live, and it was so hyped up, and I was thinking, man, this is going to be so great. They're going to get rid of this. They're going to simplify that. It's going to be less syntax. They're going to get rid of magic. And then they're like, we're simplifying it by adding all of this extra ceremony.
Yes.
And the @ sign is a one-way binding, but the equal sign is a double-way binding, but the not @ is the three-way binding. And
Oh, also, all of your favorite parts of Angular are now dead. We even included a tombstone.
yeah. All right. Anything else?
Hang on, did you say PR nightmare like they got a lot of pull requests, or PR like press relations nightmare?
Public relations.
Public relations, okay.
Public relations.
Yeah, I really
PR
felt-
nightmare, like lots of pull requests. That
In the early days of that process, before they, like, when they announced it, it was a PR nightmare. But in the transition from that point to, like, the final release, like, they started, like, oh yeah, and you're gonna write it all in Dart.
I
Everyone
remember
was like,
that.
hell no, we aren't.
I was using like 1.5 or 1.6 at the time, and then
Mhm.
like we had to investigate upgrading that, and like, yeah, it's not happening. Like, we're not upgrading this. Like, if we're
Yeah.
rewriting, we're not using Angular.
The best part about it was that the Dart documentation was empty. It
Yeah.
was all to do, as well as the JavaScript documentation. It was only TypeScript documentation. Everything else was to do.
Yep.
But you're going to write it in Dart.
Yep, totally.
Yeah.
We're taking it very serious, guys, for sure. Yeah. No. But yes, there's a number of cool libraries out there for side project stuff that I don't get nearly enough time on, but yeah.
Remember when you could use Dart in the browser?
No.
That's 2024.
No, that didn't happen for me. I don't think I ever actually, I remember there was an else. Anyway, any other comments, questions, suggestions?
I'll expand my review to point out this was actually deeply validating for me. It's like, I look at colleagues' code all the time, but like, it's not even dry, right? It's not even, I have 2 instances of this logic, so I'm gonna duplicate it even though it's really shallow. It's like, this logic is used only once, but it seems kind of long or something, so I'm gonna put it off into another function in another file. And then that function seems kind of long, so I'm gonna split that into a few functions in other files. And like, when I ask about that stuff, the response is the most incoherent word salad. It's like, well, these different lines of code are orthogonal, therefore they don't belong together. Or I made the code cleaner by adding more abstraction. You know,
So
yeah.
one thing that I was going to put in the slide, if it's big enough for a file, it's big enough for another, or if it's big enough for a second file, it's big enough for a second package. Which, again, not universally true, but kind of a rule of thumb. If your file is getting so big and handling so many things, so many responsibilities that you need a second file, you probably need a second package because you're probably completely in a different realm of responsibility.
When I see this, it's always like 20 line stops. That could have been like 5 lines if it were written differently.
Yeah. So, yeah, and the counter metric, of course, is that we don't want to have left pad. You know, just because it can be a function, it could have been reused somewhere, doesn't mean that it should be all packaged. Left pad maybe could have gone with like 2 or 3 other string functions or something like that.
Yeah. Usually people are like, they don't really expect that it will even be will ever be reused, not even trying to future proof. Just like, this feels like it should go into function because of this word that I'm going to give you as my instance.
Yeah. Yeah, I make my files too long. My files are typically 1,500 lines long. But also I don't like to do transpilers, so I will sometimes put things that should be probably still in the same package, but in 2 or 3 files. I'll just put them together because I don't want to have to deal with, well, it has to bundle with Next, and it has to bundle with React, and I want it to be usable in a browser as just JavaScript, and it has to work with TypeScript. So I end up just like throwing everything into one file because then the bundlers get less confused. Because even just having an index.js and having that reference, the file in the lib folder, I've had transpilers puke on that. So it's just like single file, fewer problems with the transpilers.
You avoid so many headaches that way. Like, I enjoy long files as well.
As the victim of some of his files, I disagree.
No, I agree that some of them should be split up. I think that it's pretty reasonable for a file to be 1,000 lines long. You know, 800, 1,000. But yeah, it's all about the responsibilities that it fills. If I'm writing a parser and it's 1,000 lines long, and every single function is related to parsing a specific type, and it's not like, it's not like, say, for example, Markdown, where it could parse JavaScript or it could parse Python, or it could, you know, and those should be their own files. But where it's something like, you know, JSON. Let's say I have a JSON parser and it's 1,200 lines long, which I don't think it would be, but you know, it's just 1,200 lines long. It's just like it does one thing. All of the things that you need to know in order to understand the process from top to bottom are there from top to bottom. Again, this goes back, like, it's easier to read from top to bottom than it is to read side to side. Like, if you've got every single function in its own file, I know that VS Code is optimized for this, and so like they make it really easy to view like 600 files in one window or something. But yeah, that's not. I don't use
But
VS
then you
Code
run
because
out of
it's
file
so slow.
watchers. Then you run out of file watchers on your system.
I guess if you're using Linux, but if you're using Mac, you only have to attach the file watcher to the directory. So it's kind of like doing your listener event on document.body. Really efficient.
I do like doing
Percent Docker.
that. Wait, what?
Campus notify in Docker on Mac, you just have a huge issue because of the mismatch between that and
Oh.
it's easy to fix.
Yeah.
I'll get it all in.
Okay. And I'm gonna just throw out there one more time. Any more things? And then I'm gonna
I think you should add more examples.
Yeah, yeah. I had some more that I just didn't put in the slides because I just got so many things. So many things. Anyway. Yeah. iCloud's letting me know that the phone hasn't been back